The morning mist clung to the towering pines of the boreal forest like a whispered secret, refusing to let go as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy. Thomas McKinnon adjusted his worn flannel shirt and hefted his axe over his broad shoulder, the familiar weight as comforting as an old friend. At 42, he had spent more than half his life among these trees in northern Ontario, and the forest had become more than just his workplace. It was his sanctuary. The sound of his boots crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles created a rhythmic symphony that had accompanied his solitary mornings for the past 3 years. Ever since Margaret had passed, the silence of his small cabin had become unbearable, driving him to seek solace among the ancient giants that surrounded his property. The trees didn't judge, didn't ask questions, and most importantly, they didn't remind him of the laughter that once filled his home. Thomas paused at the edge of a small clearing, wiping the sweat from his weathered face despite the crisp October air. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and his breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the gentle breeze. He had marked several mature white pines for selective harvesting, trees that had lived their full life and whose removal would allow younger saplings to flourish. It was sustainable forestry, the way his father had taught him, and his father before him. As he approached the first marked tree, something caught his eye that made him freeze mid-step. Nestled against the base of a massive oak, partially hidden by a tangle of wild blueberry bushes, was a small figure. Thomas blinked hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, there, curled into a tight ball, was a young girl. His heart hammered against his ribs as he dropped his axe and approached slowly, the way he might approach a wounded deer. The child appeared to be around 10 years old, with matted brown hair that fell in tangled waves around her pale face. Her clothes, a thin pink sweater and dark jeans, were torn and dirty, clearly inadequate for the harsh Canadian wilderness. But what struck Thomas most was her absolute stillness. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, as if she had retreated so far into herself that the outside world had ceased to exist. "Hey there, little one," Thomas said softly, crouching down several feet away. His voice, roughened by years of solitude and the occasional conversation with Jake at the hardware store in town, sounded foreign even to his own ears. The girl's eyes flickered toward him for just a moment before returning to their vacant stare. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker, but the nearest trail was miles away, and no sensible parent would bring a child so deep into the wilderness unprepared. A runaway. The thought made his chest tighten. In his 25 years of living in these woods, he had never encountered anything like this. "Are you hurt?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. Still no response. Thomas noticed that her small hands were clutched tightly around something, a worn stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. One of its ears was missing, and its fur was matted with dirt and what looked like dried tears. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them and sending a shower of golden maple leaves spiraling down around them. The girl's thin sweater provided no protection against the cold, and Thomas could see that her lips were beginning to turn blue. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had happened to her, she needed immediate help. "I'm Thomas," he said, settling into a cross-legged position on the forest floor, making himself less imposing. "I live just through those trees there. Do you see that smoke?" He pointed toward the thin column of gray smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. "That's my home. It's warm there, and I've got hot chocolate and blankets." The mention of warmth seemed to penetrate whatever barrier the girl had built around herself. Her eyes moved slightly toward the direction he was pointing, though she remained perfectly still otherwise. Thomas studied her face more carefully, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her cheekbones protruded slightly, signs that she hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe longer. But it was her expression that troubled him most. He had seen that look before in the mirror during the darkest days after Margaret's death. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, felt too much pain to process. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't leave you out here. It's going to get cold tonight, probably below freezing. And there are bears around here, black bears mostly, but they're getting ready for winter and they're hungry." At the mention of bears, the girl's grip on her stuffed rabbit tightened visibly. It was the first real reaction he had gotten from her, and it told him that whatever had stolen her voice, it hadn't taken away her instinct for self-preservation. Thomas slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thermos. The metal was still warm from the coffee he had poured before leaving the cabin. "I've got some hot coffee here. It's got sugar and cream in it. More like hot chocolate, really. Would you like some?" He unscrewed the cap and poured a small amount into the metal cup that served as the thermos's lid. The rich aroma of coffee mixed with vanilla creamer filled the air between them. The girl's nostrils flared slightly, and Thomas caught the briefest glimpse of longing in her eyes before she looked away again. "I'm going to set this right here," Thomas said, placing the cup on a flat rock between them. "You can have it whenever you want. No pressure." He leaned back against a nearby tree and waited, studying the girl's face for any sign of progress. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of autumn, the distant call of a loon from the lake, the rustle of small creatures preparing for winter, the gentle whisper of wind through the pines. But between Thomas and the girl, there was only silence. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the girl's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the cup. Her movements were slow and cautious, like those of a wild animal approaching food left by humans. She wrapped her small fingers around the warm metal and brought it to her lips, taking a tiny sip. The warmth seemed to bring some color back to her pale cheeks, and Thomas felt a small surge of hope. "That's good," he said encouragingly. "You drink as much as you want." As the girl continued to sip the coffee, Thomas found himself studying her more closely. Despite the dirt and the tangled hair, he could see that she was a beautiful child with delicate features and intelligent eyes. Her clothes, though torn and dirty, had once been of good quality. This wasn't a child from a neglectful home. Something specific and traumatic had brought her to this state. The sun was climbing higher now, filtering through the canopy in golden shafts that illuminated the clearing like a cathedral. Thomas knew he needed to make a decision soon. He couldn't leave her here, but he also couldn't force her to come with him. Trust, he realized, would have to be earned one small gesture at a time. "My cabin's not fancy," he said conversationally, as if he were talking to an old friend rather than a traumatized child who hadn't spoken a word. "But it's got a good wood stove, and I made a big pot of vegetable soup yesterday. My wife Margaret, she taught me how to cook before she passed. Said a man should know how to take care of himself." His voice caught slightly at the mention of Margaret, but he pressed on. "She would have liked you, I think. She always wanted children of our own." The girl's eyes found his face again, and this time they stayed there. Thomas saw something in those depths. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of curiosity. It was a start. The afternoon sun had shifted considerably by the time Thomas noticed the girl's eyelids growing heavy. She had finished the entire cup of coffee and was now clutching her stuffed rabbit even tighter, as if drawing strength from its familiar presence. The temperature was dropping steadily, and Thomas knew that nightfall in the Canadian wilderness could be deadly for someone so unprepared. "Listen, sweetheart," Thomas said, using the same gentle tone he had maintained throughout their silent vigil. "I know you don't know me, and I know you're scared, but it's going to get really cold tonight, and I can't in good conscience leave you out here." He paused, watching her face for any reaction. "I'm going to stand up now real slow, and I'm going to offer you my hand. If you don't want to take it, that's okay. But I'd like you to walk with me to my cabin. It's not far. Maybe a 10-minute walk through the trees." Thomas rose slowly, his joints protesting after sitting on the cold ground for so long. He extended his weathered hand toward the girl, palm up, in a gesture of invitation rather than demand. "You can bring your rabbit. And if you don't like it at my place, if you want to leave, I won't stop you, I promise." The girl stared at his outstretched hand for what felt like an eternity. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out in her expressive eyes, the desire for safety warring with whatever fear had driven her to this remote place. Finally, moving as if every muscle in her body protested, she slowly uncurled herself from her protective ball. Standing, Thomas was struck by how small she was. The top of her head barely reached his waist, and her thin frame made her appear even more fragile. She didn't take his hand, but she did take a tentative step in his direction, and Thomas felt his heart lift with hope. "That's perfect," he said encouragingly. "You're doing great. Just follow me and we'll take it nice and slow." The walk through the forest was unlike any Thomas had ever experienced. Normally, he moved through these woods with the confident stride of someone who knew every root and rock. But now he found himself acutely aware of every obstacle that might trip up his small companion, every branch that might catch her torn clothing, every sound that might startle her back into her shell of silence. The girl followed him at a distance of about 6 feet, her steps careful and measured. She paused frequently to look around, as if memorizing escape routes, and Thomas made sure to walk slowly enough that she never felt rushed or pressured. The stuffed rabbit remained clutched against her chest like a talisman. "Those are sugar maples," Thomas said softly, as they passed beneath a canopy of brilliant red and gold leaves. "In the spring, I tap them for syrup. Margaret used to make the best maple cookies you ever tasted." He glanced back to see if she was listening and was encouraged to find her eyes fixed on his face. "Do you like cookies?" No response, but Thomas thought he detected the slightest softening around her eyes. As they walked, Thomas found himself talking more than he had in years. He pointed out the different types of trees, explained the habits of the local wildlife, and shared gentle memories of his life with Margaret. He wasn't sure if the girl was truly listening, but something about her presence seemed to unlock a part of him that had been closed off since his wife's death. "There it is," Thomas said as his cabin came into view through the trees. "Home, sweet home." The cabin was modest but well maintained, built from logs that Thomas had milled himself from trees on his property. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and warm yellow light glowed from the windows. A small vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for winter, stretched along the south side of the building. It was the kind of place that appeared in tourism brochures advertising the quintessential Canadian wilderness experience. But for Thomas, it was simply home. The girl stopped walking when she saw the cabin, and for a moment, Thomas feared she might bolt back into the forest. Instead, she stood perfectly still, studying the building as if assessing its safety. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened. "It's okay," Thomas said, understanding her hesitation. "We'll go slow. Would you like to sit on the porch for a while first? Get used to the place?" Without waiting for an answer he couldn't expect to receive, Thomas climbed the 3 wooden steps to his front porch and settled into one of the 2 rocking chairs he had built the previous summer. The girl remained at the edge of the clearing, but she didn't retreat. The porch offered a perfect view of the small lake that lay just beyond the cabin, its surface now mirror-smooth and reflecting the changing colors of the autumn sky. A family of loons called to each other across the water, their haunting voices echoing off the surrounding hills. Thomas had always found the sound peaceful, but he noticed the girl tense at the unfamiliar calls. "Just loons," he explained. "They're waterbirds. Beautiful creatures, but they make a lot of noise. They're probably getting ready to fly south for the winter." He rocked gently in his chair, the rhythmic creaking of the wood adding to the evening's natural symphony. "Everything here is getting ready for winter. The bears are eating as much as they can, the birds are heading south, and the trees are dropping their leaves so they can sleep until spring." After several minutes, the girl took a tentative step toward the porch, then another. Thomas continued rocking, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook her. When she finally reached the steps, she sat down on the bottom one, still maintaining her distance but now within the sphere of safety that the cabin represented. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I've got that soup I mentioned and some fresh bread. I bake it myself, not as good as Margaret's, but it's not too bad." At the mention of food, the girl's stomach responded with an audible growl that made her blush and look down at her feet. It was the first truly human reaction Thomas had seen from her, and it filled him with both compassion and determination. "That settles it then," Thomas said with a gentle smile. "Let me go warm up some soup. You can stay right here on the porch if you want. I'll leave the door open so you can see what I'm doing." Thomas stood and moved toward his front door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "I know you can't talk right now, and that's okay. But if you need anything, if you get scared or want to leave, just stomp your foot on the porch boards. They're creaky old things, and I'll hear you from inside." He opened the door and was immediately greeted by the familiar warmth and comfort of his home. The main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a wood-burning stove on the other. Margaret's quilt still decorated the furniture, and her books still lined the shelves, creating an atmosphere of gentle warmth that Thomas hoped would feel welcoming rather than overwhelming to his unexpected guest. As promised, Thomas left the door wide open while he worked in the kitchen. He could see the girl's silhouette on the porch steps, still clutching her rabbit, still maintaining her vigil. The soup, a hearty blend of vegetables and barley that Margaret had taught him to make, was still warm on the stove, and Thomas ladled a generous portion into a ceramic bowl painted with small wildflowers. He added a thick slice of the bread he had baked that morning, spread with butter and a touch of his homemade maple syrup, and poured a glass of fresh milk from the cow he kept in the small barn behind the cabin. The simple meal represented everything wholesome and nourishing about his life in the wilderness. "Soup's ready," Thomas called softly, appearing in the doorway with the tray. "Would you like to eat out here on the porch, or would you feel comfortable coming inside?" The girl's eyes moved from Thomas to the warm interior of the cabin, then back to his face. Thomas could see the internal debate playing out in her expression, hunger and the promise of warmth battling against whatever trauma had stolen her voice and her trust in adults. Finally, moving like a deer approaching a salt lick, she stood and took one careful step toward the open door. The girl stood at the threshold of Thomas's cabin for what felt like an eternity, one small foot on the porch and the other poised to either step forward into warmth and safety or flee back into the familiar darkness of the forest. Thomas remained perfectly still in the doorway, the tray of food balanced in his hands, understanding that this moment was crucial. Whatever decision she made now would determine whether he could truly help her or whether she would disappear back into the wilderness, possibly forever. The aroma of the vegetable barley soup seemed to make the decision for her. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, and with a movement so quick it was almost a dart, she stepped across the threshold and into Thomas's home. "Welcome," Thomas said simply, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. It had been 3 years since anyone other than the occasional repair technician had crossed this threshold, and having this small, wounded presence in his home stirred something deep in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since Margaret's illness. The girl stood just inside the door, her back pressed against the wall as if she needed to feel the solid wood behind her for security. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on knowing all the exits and potential threats. Thomas moved slowly to the small dining table that sat beneath the window overlooking the lake. The table was just large enough for 2 people. He and Margaret had never needed anything bigger, and he set the tray down carefully before pulling out one of the chairs. "This seat has the best view of the water," he said conversationally, as if he were hosting a dinner party rather than trying to coax a traumatized child to eat her first real meal in days. "Sometimes you can see the loons swimming, or the occasional moose coming down to drink." The girl remained pressed against the wall, but Thomas noticed her eyes kept returning to the steaming bowl of soup. The internal battle between hunger and fear was written clearly across her pale features. Thomas sat down in the opposite chair and began eating his own portion of soup, making sure his movements were slow and non-threatening. "You know," he said between spoonfuls, "when Margaret first brought me home to meet her parents, I was so nervous I couldn't eat a bite. Just sat there staring at my plate while her mother piled on more and more food." He chuckled softly at the memory. "Margaret finally had to kick me under the table to get me to take a bite. Turned out her mother made the best roast beef in Ontario, and I was missing out because I was too scared to try it." At the mention of being scared, the girl's eyes found his face. Thomas saw recognition there, the understanding that he was talking about fear, something she knew intimately. "Sometimes when we're scared," Thomas continued gently, "our bodies forget how to do normal things like eating or sleeping or—" He paused meaningfully, "talking. It's okay. Our bodies are just trying to protect us the only way they know how." The girl's grip on her stuffed rabbit loosened slightly, and Thomas took this as encouragement to continue. "That rabbit looks like he's been through a lot with you," Thomas observed. "What's his name?" The question hung in the air between them. The girl's mouth opened slightly, as if she were going to respond, but then closed again without making a sound. Her eyes filled with frustration, and Thomas could see the struggle playing out on her face, the desire to communicate warring with whatever had stolen her voice. "It's okay," Thomas said quickly. "He doesn't need a name right now. Sometimes the important things don't need words." This seemed to calm her, and after a few more minutes of watching Thomas eat, she finally pushed herself away from the wall. Her steps were hesitant and careful, but she made her way to the table and climbed into the chair he had pulled out for her. Up close, Thomas could see more details that concerned him. There were fading bruises on her arms, partially hidden by her torn sweater. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, and there was a haunted quality to her eyes that spoke of things no child should ever have to witness. The girl picked up the spoon with trembling hands and took a tentative sip of the soup. The warmth seemed to unlock something in her, and she began eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in far too long. Thomas had to resist the urge to tell her to slow down, knowing that she needed to eat at her own pace, in her own way. As she ate, Thomas continued his gentle monologue, sharing stories about life in the cabin, about Margaret, about the rhythms of the forest through the seasons. He talked about the family of raccoons that had taken up residence under his porch last spring, about the time a black bear had wandered into his garden and eaten all his tomatoes, about the aurora borealis that sometimes danced across the northern sky on clear winter nights. When the girl had finished every drop of soup and every crumb of bread, Thomas cleared the dishes away and returned with a plate of oatmeal cookies and a glass of warm milk. "These were Margaret's recipe," he said, sitting back down. "She always said cookies were the best medicine for a broken heart." The girl looked at the cookies with longing but didn't reach for them immediately. Thomas took one himself and bit into it, closing his eyes with exaggerated pleasure. "Still not as good as hers, but they'll do," he said with a gentle smile. Finally, the girl reached for a cookie. As she bit into it, her eyes widened slightly, the first expression of something approaching pleasure that Thomas had seen from her. She ate 2 more cookies before pushing the plate away, and Thomas was pleased to see some color returning to her cheeks. "Now then," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair, "we need to figure out sleeping arrangements. I've got a spare room. It was going to be—" He paused, the old pain of childlessness flickering across his face before he pushed it aside. "Well, it's got a bed and some warm quilts. You'd be safe there. But if you'd rather sleep out here by the fire, that's okay too." The girl looked toward the spare room, then back at Thomas, then toward the front door. Thomas could see her calculating distances, planning escape routes, weighing her options. "Tell you what," Thomas said, understanding her dilemma. "How about we set up some blankets here on the couch close to the fire? That way you'll be warm, but you'll also be able to see both the door and the window. Sometimes it helps to know where all the exits are." This suggestion seemed to resonate with her. She nodded slightly, the first clear communication she had given him since he'd found her in the forest. Thomas gathered quilts and pillows from the spare room, creating a comfortable nest on the couch that faced both the front door and the large window overlooking the lake. The fire crackled warmly in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls and creating an atmosphere of cozy security. "The bathroom's just down that hall if you need it," Thomas said, pointing toward the back of the cabin. "And I'll be right in my room there if you need anything. Just call out or knock or stomp your feet, whatever feels right." As the girl settled into her makeshift bed, still clutching her rabbit, Thomas felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him. This child had been entrusted to his care by circumstance, and he was determined not to fail her. "Good night, sweetheart," he said softly, turning down the kerosene lamp, but leaving the fire burning brightly. "You're safe now. Whatever happened before, whatever brought you to those woods, you're safe here." As Thomas made his way to his own room, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. It was barely audible, more breath than sound, but unmistakably a word. "Thank you." Thomas turned back toward the couch, but the girl appeared to be asleep, her breathing deep and even for the first time since he'd found her. He stood there for a long moment, wondering if he had imagined it, before quietly closing his bedroom door. Outside, the loons called across the dark water, their voices carrying the promise of new beginnings. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of reaching for his work clothes, he lay still in bed listening to the sounds of his home. For the first time in 3 years, there was another person breathing under his roof, and the knowledge filled him with both warmth and a profound sense of responsibility. The girl was still asleep on the couch when he quietly made his way to the kitchen to start the coffee. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and her small form was curled tightly under Margaret's favorite quilt, a patchwork of blues and greens that his wife had sewn from scraps of their old clothes. The stuffed rabbit was tucked securely under her chin. Thomas had just finished preparing a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast when he heard the soft sound of movement from the living room. The girl appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes more alert than they had been the day before. She was still pale and thin, but some of the haunted desperation had eased from her expression. "Good morning," Thomas said gently, not wanting to startle her back into silence. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded, a small but clear gesture that made Thomas's heart lift with hope. "I made some eggs," he continued, plating the food and setting it on the table, "and there's orange juice or milk if you prefer." The girl climbed into the same chair she had occupied the night before, and Thomas was encouraged to see that she seemed less afraid, more willing to occupy space in his home. She ate slowly but steadily, occasionally glancing up at Thomas as if gauging his mood or intentions. After breakfast, Thomas made a decision that had been forming in his mind since he woke. "I need to make a phone call," he said carefully, watching her face for signs of panic. "To the authorities in town. Not because you're in trouble," he added quickly as fear flashed in her eyes, "but because people are probably looking for you. Your family, the police, they're probably very worried." The girl's reaction was immediate and intense. She dropped her fork and shrank back in her chair, shaking her head frantically. Her mouth opened as if she were trying to speak, but only a small whimpering sound emerged. Thomas was beside her in an instant, kneeling at her level. "Hey, it's okay. Look at me." He waited until her frightened eyes met his. "I won't do anything you don't want me to do. But sweetheart, someone has to be missing you. Someone has to be scared and wondering where you are." The girl's response was to point to herself and shake her head violently, then point toward the door. The message was clear. She didn't want to be found, and she was prepared to run if necessary. "Okay," Thomas said, his mind working quickly. "What if we just call and let them know you're safe? We don't have to say where you are or give any details, just that you're alive and being taken care of." Still, the girl shook her head, but Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Part of her wanted to be found, wanted to go home, but something else, something that had driven her into the wilderness alone, was stronger. Thomas sat back on his heels, studying her face. "Someone hurt you," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Someone you were supposed to be able to trust." The girl's composure cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that were somehow more heartbreaking than any crying Thomas had ever heard. "Oh, sweetheart," Thomas murmured, reaching out instinctively before stopping himself. Would it be okay if I gave you a hug?" Through her tears, the girl looked up at him and slowly nodded. Thomas gently pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against his chest like a dam bursting. The sobs came harder now. 3 years of buried grief over Margaret, mixing with fresh pain for this broken child. They stayed like that for a long time, Thomas holding her while she cried out months or maybe years of accumulated fear and hurt. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back slightly but remained in the circle of his arms. My daddy," she whispered, the words barely audible but clear. Thomas felt his heart clench. "Your daddy hurt you." She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "Mama tried to stop him, but he hit her too. She told me to run into the woods behind our house, said to keep going until someone kind found me." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was setting something free inside her. "And someone kind did find you," Thomas said firmly. "You're safe now, I promise you, you're safe." "Emily," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes that were clearer than they had been since he found her. "My name is Emily, and this is Mr. Hopscotch." She held up her bedraggled rabbit. "Mama gave him to me when I was 3. "Emily," Thomas repeated, testing the name with the reverence it deserved. "That's a beautiful name for a very brave girl. And Mr. Hopscotch looks like he's been taking good care of you." Over the next hour, Emily's story emerged like water flowing around stones. Her father's drinking had worsened after losing his job at the lumber mill. Her mother had tried to shield her from his increasingly violent rages. The final night when everything changed, when her father's anger had exploded beyond anything they'd experienced before, and her mother had made the desperate decision to send Emily into the wilderness rather than risk her being seriously hurt. "I walked for 2 days, Emily said, her voice steady now. "I ate berries and drank from streams like Mama taught me when we went camping, but then I got lost and it got so cold at night, I thought maybe I was going to die in those woods." "But you didn't," Thomas said. "You survived because you're strong and smart, and because your mama raised you right." As the morning progressed, Thomas helped Emily make the difficult phone call to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. With Emily sitting beside him, holding his hand for courage, they reported her location and began the process that would ensure her safety. The officers who arrived that afternoon were gentle and thorough, and Thomas was relieved to learn that Emily's mother was alive, hospitalized, but recovering from her injuries. The social workers explained that Emily's father had been arrested and that she would never have to return to that dangerous situation. There would be investigations, court proceedings, and eventually, Emily would be reunited with her mother once she was well enough to provide a safe home. In the meantime, Emily would stay with Thomas under temporary foster care arrangements, a solution that brought tears of relief to both of them. As the sun set over the lake that evening, Thomas and Emily sat together on the porch steps, watching the loons glide across the water's surface. Emily had been talking almost non-stop since the officials left, as if 3 years of silence had created a dam that had finally burst. "Thomas," she said suddenly, using his name for the first time. "Yes, sweetheart? Will you teach me about the trees? Mama always said the forest was full of friends if you knew how to listen to them." Thomas smiled, remembering how Margaret used to say almost exactly the same thing. "I'd love to teach you about the trees, Emily. We'll start tomorrow with the maples. They're some of the friendliest trees in the forest." Emily leaned against his shoulder. Mr. Hopscotch clutched in her arms. "I think Mama sent me to you," she said softly. "She always told me to look for the helpers when I was scared. She said there are people in the world whose job it is to help, and you just have to be brave enough to let them." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your Mama sounds like a very wise woman." "She is," Emily said with absolute confidence. "And when she gets better, I'm going to bring her here to meet you. I think you two would be friends." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the loons called their haunting songs across the water, Thomas realized that Margaret had been right about something she used to tell him. Sometimes, the most broken things, when they're mended with love and patience, become the strongest. Emily had found her voice again, and in helping her heal, Thomas had discovered that his own heart was capable of loving and being loved once more.